Hello, my name is Sharon Pinder, and I'm the President and CEO of the Capital Region Minority Supply Development Council, and operator of the U.S. Department of Commerce's Minority Business Development Agency in Virginia, the first one of its kind in the Commonwealth minority-owned firms. Today, in this special 50th anniversary episode, we pay tribute to Anthony Robinson, CEO of MBLDEF, and we'll talk about that in just a moment, and Franklin Lee Esquire of Tidings, partner with Tidings and Rosenberg. But before I bring them on, I want to tell you a little bit about them, but then I also want to talk to you about Perrin Mitchell. And so I talked about Franklin Lee. He's one of the country's leading authorities on social economic policies that promote the use of minority-owned and women-owned businesses in government contracting. For more than 25 years, Mr. Lee has advised businesses on regulatory compliance with such policies and the federal, state, and local governments on establishing and defending commercial non-discrimination policies, and public contracting programs. Prior to entering into private practice, Mr. Lee served for 6 years as antitrust litigation counsel assigned to merger investigations in a number of industries at the Federal Trade Commission, and for over 15 years as chief counsel to the Minority Business Legal Defense and Education Fund in MBLDEF. He has numerous other experiences as well, but let me just share a little bit about Anthony Robinson, president of the Minority Business Legal Defense and Education Fund in MBLDEF. Robinson, the principal of the Robinson firm, has served concurrently with MBLDEF. As president, he's guided the company into status as premier legal advocacy and watchdog organization on behalf of small and minority businesses. And we're going to talk about MBLDEF in just a moment as some of the things that occurred under the umbrella of that organization. But the organization was founded by Perrin Mitchell, the first African American, to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from the state of Maryland. And he handpicked Mr. Robinson for this, I guess, Tony, would you say that he handpicked you to be part of the ministry? Would you say that?
That would be a fair way to put it, yes.
Well, welcome, Anthony Robinson and Franklin Lee. I'm just so honored for you to be here. And most importantly, I am excited that you are accepting our induction into our Hall of Fame, celebrating 50 years of our mission as it has endured over the last 50 years. And so thank you both for agreeing to be a part of that.
Thank you for your selection.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. One of the things that I want to do for our audience, I'm just going to tell them a little bit about Perrin Mitchell in case somebody's been living under a rock and they have no idea. But would you not agree that the late Congressman Perrin J. Mitchell is considered the father of minority businesses? And what I want to tell people, as we just heard in your introduction, in 1970, he was elected as the first African American to be elected Congress from Maryland, and he served over about 16 years, and he was a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And during his tenure, he certainly fought for equality through legislation. And in 1976, as chairman of the Small Business Committee, he attached an amendment to a $4 billion public works program that required state and local governments applying for federal contracts to reserve 10% of this money for minority-owned businesses. And he later described his effort as my most proudest congressional accomplishment. And so when you think about that and you think about the years that have passed, is your work with the late Congressman part of what inspires you to continue the work that you do? Tony?
Yeah, without question, Sharon. I had the good fortune to have met Perrin before he was elected to Congress. I was a student at Morgan State, then Morgan State College, and he was at that point contemplating his run for the Congress. And I was introduced to him by my political science professor, Augustus Adair. And when I first met him, pretty much the first thing out of his mouth is that he sees the second phase of the civil rights movement being economic development.
Mm-hmm.
And if he was elected to Congress, he would seek assignments on every committee that had anything to do with money. And among those assignments was, of course, to the Small Business Committee, which, as you've indicated, he rose to become chairman of that committee. And it was from that perch that he initiated the minority business programs that was started at that time.
And Franklin, when did you meet the congressman?
Well, now, I met the Godfather actually when I was in high school.
Okay.
I attended a rally right in front of City Hall in Baltimore. And Congressman Mitchell was standing at the top of the steps, and he was a towering figure advocating for the school superintendent at that time, Roland Patterson, Dr. Roland Patterson, office. He seemed like a towering figure. I mean, he was at the top step, and I was standing below him. But I'll never forget, he said he was pleased to meet me and that he looked forward to having another young soldier in the fight.
Oh, wow.
That kind of stuck with me for many, many years until I actually got a tremendous opportunity to work at MBLDEF by his side in this whole mission for economic empowerment.
Okay, so tell me about the creation of MBLDEF. What was the impetus behind Congressman Mitchell creating it? And then how did you all, I know it was by invitation, but what drove you to become a part of it?
Well, at least what drove me
a little bit about
was I had been a civil rights attorney when I was in private practice. Did a lot of Title VII or employment discrimination cases, and that particular avenue of approach to civil rights was beginning to sour relative to the private bar participating in that practice. And so when he approached me about MBLDEF, it was like the good Lord speaking to me. And at this time, he was contemplating his retirement from Congress. And so he said, this was 1983, 84. And he said to me that he needed to, he had already formed MBLDEF. He already incorporated MBLDEF, but it was not a fully operational organization. And so what he said to me was, I need to institutionalize my advocacy. And I took that as my life's mission, was institutionalizing MBLDEF to carry his advocacy on behalf of minority business forward.
Outstanding. And so, but what inspired him? I know he wanted to institutionalize his advocacy, but why did he come up with this idea to do this separate entity like that?
Well, as he told the story, when Public Law 95-507 and the set aside that you referred to under the Department of Transportation, for every action there's a reaction. And the majority community began suing organizations, particularly public institutions, that were implementing that law. And he felt he needed an legal advocacy arm. And so he approached most of your major civil rights organizations to join him in the fight against these lawsuits, litigation seeking to declare minority business programs unconstitutional. And so he went around to most of your major public interest firms doing civil rights work, and he could not find a taker. And so his in his defiant attitude, he said, "Well, I will create my own Justice Department," and that was the beginning of Embeldev. It was a gentleman by the name of Rotan Lee who at that time was acting as the director of Embeldev, but that was on a part-time basis. And Mr. Mitchell was interested in making it a full-time operation.
So, Franklin, when did you enter the picture?
Also, quite by serendipity. I used to clerk with Tony when I was in law school. He had a civil rights employment discrimination practice with the firm Singleton, DeShiel, and Robinson. And after I clerked for Tony, I went on to Washington to begin my legal career with the Federal Trade Commission doing antitrust work, which was anything but like civil rights law. It didn't really inspire me, but it was interesting. I learned about economics. I learned about the business world, major Fortune 500 companies doing investigations. But I used to commute from downtown Baltimore to Washington every day. I used to catch the train at Camden Yards before there was a stadium there, and go into downtown DC to the Federal Trade Commission to my job. Well, one day, for some reason, walking back to Union Station in DC, I took a detour and went through Chinatown to take a shortcut along H Street to get up to Union Station. So I'm just moseying down the street, and it was as if the hand of God reached out and grabbed me. It was a tap on the window of one of those Chinese restaurants. And it was my good friend, El Presidente, Tony Robinson.
Oh, my goodness.
Who had just come down to Washington, D.C. to start up Embeldev. And he beckoned me to come into the restaurant. I came and said, "Well, what are you doing down here?" I said, "Well, what are you doing down here?" And he explained to me about Congressman Mitchell's mission and work that he was beginning with Embeldev. And I said, "That sounds like something worth doing. I'll volunteer some time with you to help you get that show on the road." So that's how I got involved. Eventually, Tony was able to get a grant from Ford Foundation and bring me on full time as chief counsel for the organization, and I've never looked back.
Wow. And that influenced you to continue to do the work that you're doing today?
Absolutely.
Can you describe for folks what your practice is about at Tidings and Rosenberg?
It really is a continuation of the advocacy that I engaged in when I was at Embeldev. Most of what I do as a partner at Tidings and Rosenberg is help state and local governments across the country to develop legally defensible economic inclusion programs that may be race and gender neutral, race and gender conscious, like minority business programs. I also help them to defend them in court from time to time. And I advocate and represent small and minority businesses that run into all kinds of barriers in the marketplace, try to help them get integrated into the mainstream. From time to time, I also advise larger corporations on how they can better collaborate with some of the great talent, some of the great entrepreneurial talent that we have out here now in the minority business community.
And so when you all look at that time that you spent, and this was, I guess, in the late 80s, is that correct? That this occurred?
Well, I was working with Embeldev from, I guess, 1986 up to 2002 when I went into private practice.
Okay. And so during that time, because Tony, I remember seeing a clip when I was doing some research. I saw this clip of you and Congressman Mitchell was standing in the back. And I was trying to think of the court case. I think you may have been at the Supreme Court. I'm not quite sure. And it was on C-SPAN. And it was you and Russell Frisbee and I'm trying to think of the case right now. And so I'm just, when I think about that, go ahead.
I think it was Croson, wasn't it, Franklin? Was it Croson or Adoran?
It was Adoran.
Adoran.
Yeah.
It was Adoran. Okay.
Yeah.
But Russell Frisbee was like our lead attorney on a brief in the Croson case, which preceded the Adoran case. That was just an amazing journey, amazing experience, because just 3 years after I joined Embeldev, we were in the Supreme Court in the city of Richmond versus J. Croson. And then the Adirondack case came down in 1995, just a short time later. And we had briefs in front of the Supreme Court. We had some of the top lawyers in the country assisting us in the effort of defending the notion that you could have a minority business program constitutionally to remedy the ongoing effects of marketplace discrimination.
And Franklin and Russell, they work very closely with the law firm, and that quite frankly is one of my proudest moments of the work of the organization, because if you track the opinion, the majority opinion coming out of the Supreme Court on those cases, you can see where our fingerprints are all over that particular opinion about how the court maneuvered to hold those programs still remaining constitutional, but changes in how those programs would operate going forward.
For our audience,
and the efforts after that, Franklin and Russell and a number of other attorneys that we worked with across the country then formulated a strategy to create the kind of predicate that the court was requiring these programs to have going forward. And it was their hand, talking about Russell and Franklin, along with other attorneys who really organized the country, if you will, on doing what I call disparity studies that represented the constitutional justification for these programs going forward. That is, for me, one of the hallmark achievements that we had as an organization.
Franklin, what do you think in terms of some of the hallmark achievements during your time there?
Well, that's certainly right there at the top. Congressman Mitchell used to always lament to us, failure is not an option. And when the Supreme Court began turning in a more conservative way to attack and dismantle really affirmative action of all kinds, we looked for the silver lining in every opinion and held tight to it to try to develop a strategy that said, failure is not an option. We cannot afford to lose this battle, this struggle for economic empowerment. That our businesses must succeed if our communities are to succeed, if all of the previous gains we've made in the civil rights movement for access to housing, education, and employment would go by the wayside if we lacked the financial wherewithal to take advantage of those opportunities.
Okay.
So what we did in the case of the Crescent decision was we found some language that said local government is not powerless to act to ensure that the tax dollars collected from all of its citizens would not finance the evil of private prejudice. And that's the language that we grabbed onto in formulating the commercial non-discrimination policy. Our state of Maryland right here was one of the first states in the nation, probably the first state in the nation, to adopt a policy that said the state of Maryland will not engage in business with firms that discriminate in the solicitation, the selection, or the treatment of subcontractors, vendors, and suppliers. And it applies across the board in the private sector as well as the public sector. We've been planting those seeds of non-discrimination policies in ordinances from coast to coast ever since. And in my belief, it's going to stand us in good stead if indeed the current Supreme Court turns out to be more hostile than the one in 1989 that struck down the city of Richmond's minority business program.
And I do,
because
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So what we will be able to do is to go on the offensive for all the kinds of behaviors that have blocked the progress of highly qualified, legitimate minority businesses to get into the mainstream of this economy. Mm-hmm. Also set about developing a strategy to defend the legality of minority business programs across the country, as Tony mentioned, through the use of disparity studies. And that's where my previous work at the Federal Trade Commission came in handy. A lot of the methodologies that are used in disparity studies to create a strong basis and evidence upon which government may rely in developing remedial programs like minority business programs came from my work at the Federal Trade Commission, analyzing markets, looking at availability, looking at utilization, barriers to entry, and racism is a barrier to entry in the marketplace. We took those same principles and developed those methodologies in the form of disparity studies, which have evolved over the last 30 plus years, to the point now where we don't see that many legal challenges against disparity studies like we did in the 1990s.
Outstanding. So I want to go back just a moment because there were you talked about some of the landmark milestones along the way in this work that you were doing. The Adirondack decision, it was Public Law 95-507, it was Richmond versus Croson. But for our audience, if you can just take a moment to talk about kind of where it started. Was it with Public Law 95-507? And the other things were the outcomes of those. And could you just describe what was the case of Adirondack? What was Richmond versus Croson?
Well, I'll start and let Franklin kind of be the primary voice on this issue. It really started with a case called Fully Love versus Klutznick.
Okay.
Which was the first time the Supreme Court encountered the issue and upheld the constitutionality of the programs. So we came into the involvement of MBLDEF with that kind of constitutional support, if you will, from the Supreme Court. And then came Croson versus the city of Richmond. I'll let Franklin go into that, but I know Franklin advised the city of Richmond against appealing that particular case because we saw that there were kinds of pitfalls, if you will, in navigating the constitutionality issue. But the city of Richmond did not listen and appealed the case to the Supreme Court. And you can take it from there, Franklin.
Yeah, the Richmond case was really about a large white contractor out of Columbus, Ohio, that was a plumbing contractor, and they had gone into the public sector and they had won its contract in Richmond to install toilets in a prison. So it's a pretty crappy case, and there's some crappy facts in the case. But basically, the city mandated that Croson had to subcontract at least 30% of its contract to minority businesses.
And I would imagine then at 30% seemed like an enormous amount.
Yeah, when you think about it, what part of a toilet do you subcontract? Right? So there was no commercially useful function really in terms of what part of that contract they could subcontract. There were no licensed toilet supply companies that were minority owned. There weren't any plumbers of any significant size that could handle 30% of that contract. And so rather than seek a waiver of the program, Croson just decided to sue and say this whole business is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. So there was a case with bad facts, and what the story is not really told or known that much, is that there was a concerted effort on the part of very conservative legal foundations to dismantle affirmative action. They handpicked that case to go up and to use that as a basis for attacking affirmative action broadly. The Deputy Attorney General for the Department of Justice at the time and during the Reagan administration was a guy by the name of Brad Reynolds. And he would meet on a regular basis with an institution called the Heritage Foundation.
Really?
which was just located a few doors down the street from where Beldev's first office was,
Okay.
how they would try to make sure this case got up to the Supreme Court. When the decision came down, we weren't terribly surprised, but we had already been proactively thinking under Congressman Mitchell's guidance, well, what do we do now? How do we make sure that all that has been gained by cities across this country, being market access for minority businesses that they never had before, how do we make sure that doesn't just fall by the wayside? And so we started coalescing some of the top consultants in the country, some of the top legal minds. We called in all the municipal attorneys to Washington, D.C. to have a big powwow about how do we satisfy this new strict scrutiny standard that the Supreme Court's handed down. They didn't outlaw affirmative action per se, but they said you got to have a whole bunch more evidence than what you had in Richmond. All they had in the record in Richmond was saying that, well, 50% of our population is Black. It's only reasonable that 30% of the money goes to Black firms. But they did no analysis, no quantitative analysis, no anecdotal evidence really about specific instances of discrimination in the marketplace. So that's what started it all. Adoran, which came several years later, was an effort to expand this attack on affirmative action programs by going to the federal sector and saying that Congress does not really have any more latitude in establishing affirmative action remedies than any state and local government does. That's basically what Adoran stood for. And Adoran, you had a white contractor that, like the guardrail, a landscaping business, subcontractor. Yeah. And there was a program that the Department of Transportation had where you weren't required to meet any DBE goal or minority business goal. But if you did, the government would pay you extra money. It's called a subcontractor compensation clause. It was a voluntary program that was attacked. But the principle that the Supreme Court laid down in the Adoran case was the mere use of a racial classification by any government entity, whether it's local, state, or federal, on its face, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, unless you have a strong basis in evidence of ongoing effects of marketplace discrimination. So we had to completely revamp the DBE program as a result of that Croson case. Clinton, when he came into office in the 90s, his Justice Department went about trying to reform the DBE program, and it was a whole effort called Mend It, Don't End It back in those days. And that's why we still have a DBE program today, while billions of dollars in infrastructure projects can still go to disadvantaged business enterprises because of the revamping of that program that we helped to undertake it in BelDef to strengthen the factual predicate and then to modify the program so that it could pass constitutional muster under strict scrutiny.
Outstanding. Can you all talk a bit about 95507 before I'd like to get your perspective on where you see minority programs going today, which you've seen over the years, but where do you see it going? And do you feel like there's an attack on affirmative action?
Definitely, there's attack on affirmative. There's a continuing attack on affirmative action, without question. But let me focus on 95507 for just a moment. That was Mr. Mitchell's signature policy that remains intact today. And what he did with that law, it's known most for the 8A program, which was a modification of the Small Business Act. And he used the set-aside provisions of the Small Business Act in favor of minority companies going through the 8A program. That's what it's known for. But if you look at the law, the policy closely, you will see that Mr. Mitchell and other members of the caucus that got that legislation passed sought to cover all three major elements of doing business in America. He addressed the issue of access to capital
Mm-hmm.
through the MESB program. So he attempted to address the issue of capital access. He also attempted to address the issue of management training. So a lot of the training programs that came out of the SBA was a result of 95507. So he addressed both money, market, and management, which are the three major elements of Public Law 95507 that he addressed as a matter of policy for the SBA's program.
Hmm. So,
You want
and so, as we stand today, what do you see? I mean, so you guys still wouldn't have been busy all these years if there was not an issue of discrimination that continues to exist. But I'm looking at organizations like the National Minority Supply Development Council, 50 years old. We still, and then we know if not for advocacy organizations, public policy, then things would not grow. But as we look at the numbers of minority businesses, the pot that has gotten bigger, what do you think of where we are and where we're going?
Well, I'll start out, Frank. I'm concerned about the Supreme Court, quite frankly. I think they are the Federalist Society that picked most of your justices on the Supreme Court is an organization Franklin and I have seen in the past. They're much like the Associated General Contractors of America, who financed a lot of this litigation. I think that affirmative action is clearly in the bullseye of the Supreme Court. And I think they're going to make it a great deal more difficult for these programs to continue. And I think the approach that they may take on it, and this is something Franklin and I have not talked about, but I think the approach that they're going to take is to prohibit race-conscious programs. That's where I think they're going to head and conclude with they're going to begin with these higher education affirmative action programs, but they're ultimately going to impact, I think, race consciousness as a matter of policy, prohibiting race consciousness as a matter of policy.
I wholeheartedly agree, Tony. It's amazing, even when we're not in constant communication like we used to be, we're still on the same page.
Yeah.
This Supreme Court is a rogue Supreme Court, and I'm just going to put it just like that. They've already demonstrated in how they dismantled Roe versus Wade that they have no regard for legal precedent. That's a 50-year-old legal precedent they just tossed aside as if it were nothing. Women have no right to privacy with their own bodies. They have no control or power over their own bodies. It would be nothing for this Supreme Court to come around and say, per se, use of race is in violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. Per se, affirmative action is dead. That is what I fear will happen. I will not be surprised if it does. But we've been preparing for that day for quite some time. Even language in the Croson case from Sandra Day O'Connor that said, the day is coming when these programs may no longer be necessary. It's not today, but it's coming. Well, I think that day may be a lot closer now. And so as a result, we've been hedging our bets, as it were, by creating what I call hybrid minority business programs. They have race and gender neutral elements to them in addition to the race conscious minority business element. Small local business programs where you can set aside prime contracts for small local businesses. Set aside, the term set aside only became a term of disrepute when it began being applied to minority businesses. The SBA has been setting aside contracts for small businesses since 1958. Nobody's really challenged that. So it's only when you're trying to remedy the ongoing effects of marketplace discrimination that we've seen this hostility in the courts towards this notion. But like I said, we've been working diligently to try to prepare for this day. And as Congressman Mitchell said, and it still rings true today, failure is not an option. We will find a way to prevail and to ensure that our businesses have a real opportunity to be mainstream participants in the American economy. We've got a ton of data from the disparity studies that have been conducted. And we're also starting to do economic impact analysis, which will make the compelling business justification for why we've got to find a way to be more inclusive in our marketplace. Because if you've got anybody that's played Parker Brothers version of Monopoly, you can always tell when the game is almost over. Because one player's got a stack of money this high, they've got a deed to all the property on the board, and everybody else is just rolling their dice, trying their best to get around the board to collect a little measly $200. And that game is over. Well, yeah, you'll have somebody that's a winner, but are they really winning if they have nobody to play with? If they don't have other vibrant businesses in the marketplace to do business with? What will happen to America's economy if we don't find a way to be more inclusive? So we're beginning to change our strategy and change our messaging as to the importance of economic inclusion, not so much on a legal basis, but on a business basis, because that's where it really makes the difference.
Let me add one other point to Franklin's points. Not only did you have set-asides for small business since 1958, but since the Second World War, you have a program that one of our board members used to call the White Boys 8A program, and that was inclusion in the industrial base. So if you became a business recognized as part of the industrial base, then this federal government sets aside contracts, regardless of what's going on, to keep that industrial base ready for activation. So they set aside contracts for those companies that are part of the industrial base to keep them prepared and keep the country prepared for some type of economic calamity.
So let me ask the question, what can we do? I mean, you all have been in the fight, in the trenches, in the fight for decades. When you see destruction coming, what can minority businesses do? What can advocacy organizations do? What can corporate America do or government do? What do you see happening that can help maybe reverse the trend? Do you know what I'm asking?
Yeah, that's the $64,000 or $64 million question at this point. Access to capital has always been at the foundation of the impediment to minority business growth. And I just want to add one little anecdote to what Tony was talking about. One of the Department of Defense created this thing called the Internet that's made Amazon one of the leading corporations in the world. At the time the Internet was created by DARPA, there was a need to have some entity, and they privatized this, have some entity to assign the domain names to every website.
Mm-hmm.
It was American names. Few people know that the very first firm that served in that capacity was an African-American owned firm called Network Solutions.
By Emmett
Yes, Emmett
McHenry,
McHenry.
who we are inducting
Absolutely.
into this Hall of Fame as well.
Well, he's got some stories to tell too, so I won't steal his thunder, but I will say this. Network Solutions is no longer in that role because they couldn't get access to capital to expand to meet the demand once the internet blew up. There was such demand for assignment of domain names for websites that they couldn't keep up with it. They couldn't get the capital to expand to handle demand, so they had to sell the company to another company that became a $1 billion venture. There's not to this, I mean, we've made tremendous progress, no doubt, through the advocacy of folks like Congressman Mitchell and the Minority Supplier Development Council as well. But we're nowhere near where we should be. And that hunger has to remain to try to go to the next level. Because if we don't, it's not only going to be bad for African American communities or certain minority communities that don't have the financial wherewithal to maintain their own infrastructure or their own schools or their own institutions. It's going to be a really devastating blow to the entire country because this country is getting browner and browner.
Mm-hmm.
The demographics have already switched over in Maryland, where more than 50% of the babies born in Maryland are people of color. And if we continue to have these huge economic disparities, where the color of your skin pretty much is a proxy for your prospects in life and the kind of life you get to lead, it's not going to bode well for the future of this country. And I think the major corporations, our corporate community is going to step up, and they have stepped up in many ways. But they're going to realize that in a capitalist economy, it's so important that you have a vibrant marketplace where all segments of the population are participating. Because if they're not, you got economic deserts. That's a real drain on your development and growth. And our standing in the world will suffer if we're not able to find a way to be inclusive in how we do business with one another.
Let me add to that the mend it, don't end it policy under Clinton came about for reasons that Franklin identified, but in addition, one of the untold stories, I think, was the role that NMSDC played under Harriet, Michelle, and Steve. They led a delegation of major corporations to the White House in support of these programs. And it was out of that meeting that, at least I first heard articulated, Clinton's mend it but don't end it policy. Similar activities are going to have to take place as this case comes before the Supreme Court. They're going to have to make the case that Franklin just made about why minority inclusion is in the best interest, is in the security interest of the United States, not only for domestic reasons, but for international reasons. That the inclusion of people of color in the economic mainstream is critical to our national security interest. And that case needs to be made in briefs that go before the Supreme Court as they consider this litigation, as well as the obvious ones on minority business and minority advocacy organizations as well.
So it sounds like you all will continue to be busy. But
but I'm ready to retire. Why can't I retire?
That's my next point. I think for our audience and the message that we carry about the fight you've been warriors for quite some time. I just want to see how we can help. Whether it's when you go back to the origin of why Congressman Mitchell created MBLDEF, well, it's to support what we're advocating for, but that takes money, that takes time, and that takes resources. Franklin, I want people to know what you're doing in private practice as a partner of a major law firm. That is your practice. I don't know anybody else who has a practice specifically dedicated to what you do, which is like remarkable. And Tony, the fact that still today, years later, well, I know it took 53 years for them to make MBDA an agency, right? So we don't want. um, but I think that, it's incumbent upon us folks that are listening, that have been educated from this conversation today, to help. And I think that we want to give out some websites. We want to give out some information in terms of how people can help. I'd like to read this quote that I found from that the Congress had made, and it was something I pulled out. And it said, if you believe in fighting racism, you make a commitment for the rest of your life, Mitchell said after he retired from the House. There's no getting off of that train. You can't say, I've put 5 years in fighting racism and now I'm finished. No, you're not finished. Our job is to fight it every day, to continue to shove it down, and when it rises up, to shove it down even harder. Does that sound like your mentor?
It sounds like it.
Yeah, that sounds like why I can't retire. I wanted to go play some golf with Tony, but I don't have time. It's been interesting with the pandemic. It's given us all, I guess, a lot of time to reflect on the way things are and why they were. There was a time when I had no gray hair. I was optimistic. Our generation would be the one to put an end to racism. And then we see what happened to George Floyd, and you get to thinking, wait a minute, if things come full circle, are we back to where we started?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like a gut punch. But then I remember the words of Congressman Mitchell. It's like the fight is never over. Once you join this army, buddy, there ain't no getting out of it. And the struggle continues.
Yeah, you can try to defect or anything else, but it'll find you.
The fight will find you. Is that what you're saying, Tony?
Yeah, it'll find. Yeah.
Can't get away from it.
Interestingly enough, that's how Mr. Mitchell got started in his quest on behalf of civil rights. Was his brother, Clarence Mitchell, had made a trip to the Eastern Shore and saw a lynching. And he was committed himself, and he got parent committed to that issue as a result of that experience. And what we're seeing, our minority businesses are being lynched. And I think some of our work along those lines are also things I'm very proud of, relative to some of the major corporations that were systematically lynching minority firms, particularly as their subcontractors. And we've done work there, and that's some of the work that I'm proud of that we did.
Well, we are very proud of the two of you, and I could not be prouder to be a part of an effort to induct you into a Hall of Fame, and could not be prouder to, on behalf of America, I say thank you for the work, your commitment, your sacrifice, and all that you do for all the years you've been doing it. It's just remarkable. And we can't thank you enough. It's nothing that we can do to give you enough. That's why we've got to figure out how to get in the fight and help as well. So thank you very, very much for your time. This has been outstanding. This is going down in history. We're going to mark this. I'm going to put it everywhere. So thank you.
Thank you, Sharon, for all that you do.
Thank you, Sharon. You've been right there with us every step of the way, and we do appreciate you.
Listen, but you all been down in the dog fight. I'm just admire what you all do. My goodness. Okay. Hey, I think that may be it. And I just want to, on behalf of the Capital Region Minority Supply Development Council, to thank our guest today. And we will continue. This is not the end of the conversation. We've been blessed with the presence of some warriors, and we will continue to monitor and continue to see how we can get into the fight ourselves.